Hello and welcome to The Current Thing with me, Dixon, where we talk about politics, the culture war, and anything else that comes up. And today we have another top guest, the writer, commentator, and co-founder of Thoughtful Therapist. It's James Esses. Thanks for doing the show, James.
Pleasure. Nice to chat to you, Nick.
Yeah, it's a great time to get you on, actually, because you've just had an interaction with Elon Musk, which maybe we'll get onto that in a sec. But just so our listeners know who you are, I'm sure most people have heard of you, but do you mind just briefly recounting your sort of story? You got expelled from your university, you got dropped from Childline, that type of thing.
Yeah. So I mean, I was just a kind of lowly civil servant, former lawyer, and I was trying to start up a new vocation in psychotherapy. I was doing a master's degree. I was counselling children at Childline, operating, under the radar, really, just kind of focusing on getting my qualification and trying to do some good with the clients that I was seeing. But then gender ideology and the sex versus gender war kind of kicked off, and I felt that I had to say something about it because I was really concerned about what the impact was, particularly on children, of this. So I spoke out. I wrote a petition to the UK government, I did some interviews, and I wrote a few articles, and for that I found myself expelled over an email from my master's degree. I was given the boot from Childline, where I've been counselling children for 5 years, and I'm now in the middle of litigation against my former master's course provider on the basis of discrimination. And since then, I've kind of devoted as much time as I possibly can towards advocating on behalf of particularly children, but also others in society, women as well, in terms of the impact that this ideology is having across society.
And I believe you've raised about 120,000 on your crowdfunder for your legal case.
I have, which is incredible. I mean, I never envisaged I could raise that to begin with. And the sickening thing is that that's not even going to be enough. I'm 2 years into the case. We're caught up in various preliminary issues. I'm still waiting on a trial date. So I'm going to need to raise more, but I'm eternally grateful for people who donate. But it demonstrates just how strongly people feel about these issues. And mine's not the only case. I've seen other cases funded, again, hundreds of thousands of pounds. And it's a shame that people are having to part with their hard-earned cash on this, but clearly it's too important to fight.
Yeah, and you totally deserve to get that money because it all comes back to defending children, sticking up for children, which is why I suppose you've done all this, and women. But what is your hope for that case then? What's a win in that case to you?
Well, look, I think there's an abstract sense of justice, right? I want some kind of public acknowledgement of wrongdoing in terms of what they did to me, which you can't really quantify. I also do want the money that I spent on those 3 years back. That was tens of thousands of pounds. I also want compensation for the harm that's been caused to me. I mean, as I said, basically my future vocational plans have gone completely up in smoke. And I want to send a message to institutions that if they try and do this to their students, that they're going to face justice. So there's a number of reasons why I'm taking this. But I never wanted to take a case. I mean, as I mentioned at the start, I've practiced as a lawyer before. I always said I wanted to stay out of the courtroom in my own personal life because of how expensive and time-consuming it is. But sometimes you've got no choice.
Yeah, they also probably didn't realise they were messing with a former lawyer. But yeah, I mean, I suppose you have to get some sort of redress because they suddenly kicked you out basically overnight because of your views. They tweeted about it as well to add insult to injury. It was pretty disgusting.
It's shocking. I mean, it feels so inherently wrong on many levels. It also seems strategically very bizarre. I mean, they literally threw their own rule book and policies out the window. I mean, I've never to this day had a conversation with anyone in the institution about it. There was no hearing, there was no appeal, there was absolutely nothing. It's crazy, and they probably thought that it would shut me up, and it hasn't worked. So.
And one thing that struck me from another interview you did is that you never got to even see the policies because they immediately blocked your email. They blocked you from everything, so you couldn't even see the policies they were citing that they were kicking you out under. What was the specific thing you said again? Was it just that you were doing certain activism with you were tweeting? What was the exact thing? Do you know?
The key thing is that around this time, the government were announcing they were going to ban conversion therapy, quote unquote conversion therapy, and myself and various other practitioners were really concerned that that would have a chilling effect on the therapy profession. It would basically force therapists, we feared, into affirming children down a path of medical transitioning. So I wrote a petition on the gov.uk petitions website, which any citizen of this country is entitled to do, and it got 10,000 signatures, and it got quite a good response at the time from the government. It was basically that. It was that plus a few associated interviews and articles I wrote about that. That was the extent of it. I made a point of saying that conversion therapy, in the strict sense of the term, is abhorrent, is disgusting. Thankfully, most of those practices have been criminalized many years ago, but there's a real risk of criminalizing ethical talking therapy, and I wasn't prepared to stand for it. And supposedly, according to my institution, that brought them into disrepute.
Yeah, well, it sounds like they're doing a good job of that themselves. But so, I mean, just for any of our listeners that don't know, they probably mainly do, but yeah, they're now using conversion therapy to essentially mean you won't be allowed to sort of say to the child, are you sure you want to go through with this? I mean, that's my broad understanding of it. Is that right?
Well, the problem is we don't really know because the language is so vague and ambiguous. That's one of the real risks of legislating in this space. I mean, when the government put forward its last proposal, it said that the definition would include anyone who suppresses someone else's gender identity. But I mean, what does that mean, suppress? It's quite common for therapists to challenge things clients are saying. It's quite common for therapists to consider other causes in their life and different options. So, could that be technically suppressing somebody's gender identity? I mean, possibly. And I speak to lots of therapists who say that if that legislation went through, they just would refuse to see children who are struggling with their gender, full stop. So that can't be a good thing.
Right, that's terrible, yeah. And therapists may well take a sort of devil's advocate position just to reflect another position to you. Would that be suppressing? Have you considered this? That could. How dare you? You're suppressing me. Is that in the definition of suppressing?
Well, it could well be, and the term conversion therapy now is a completely toxic term, and it doesn't reflect any form of reality. I mean, firstly, it's not really therapy. Any kind of surveys have shown that the vast majority of these kind of practices take place in religious or family settings. So it's a misnomer to call it conversion therapy at all. But I mean, I've come across YouTube videos written by trans activists aimed at children entitled How to Spot a Conversion Therapist. And some of the examples they give are if the therapist misgenders you. So if that's the threshold we're using for conversion therapy, then I really fear for any future legislation.
It's quite clever, really. They use terms that people have a certain association with. In this case, conversion therapy, people have a negative association with it, and they try and tie it to that. Or it's kind of like they use the word educate, which people have a positive association with, or learn. I've educated. Howard from Take That. I've now educated myself, and now I realize I should never speak up again on anything. It's like they abuse words, and they say inclusive when they mean excluding people.
Oh, it's all manipulation of language and wordplay completely. And this is the difficulty. We're speaking at cross purposes. It's difficult to actually have a proper conversation on these topics and getting past all the kind of guff and bluster with it. But yeah, I mean, look, conversion therapy, what people think of is some of the abhorrent practices that took place in the past, like electric shock treatment and corrective rape. Absolutely vile, disgusting things which thankfully have been long criminalized. But this legislation is to deal with therapists in a therapy room having a conversation with their client.
Yeah, it's completely abusive language, as you say. And is it deliberate? I mean, that's the question. I mean, this brings me on to something I wanted to ask you. I mean, are your enemies sincere about the well-being of children but misguided? Or are they just ideologues prepared to sacrifice children on the altar of their ideology?
I think a bit of both, and it's not always easy to actually work out which somebody is. I think there's people who genuinely believe that this is all in the best interest of these children, allowing them to truly be who they are deep down. But I would submit that they're utterly naive and misguided, because we can see in real life the harm that's been caused to these children, to effectively mutilating bodies, and others, I don't know. Others, I think, are so swept up in trying to, I don't know, rebel against society. I mean, it goes hand in hand with other postmodernistic ideas and ways of thinking, and I will often see gender ideology come up in the same conversation as critical race theory, for example. So these things do go hand in hand together. And this idea that everything is subjective and everything should be challenged. And it's not helpful when we're dealing with things that are concrete reality, like the immutability of biological sex.
Yeah, when you were speaking then, I thought, is it a sort of Rousseauian idea, the idea that the child's sort of free and perfect, and then we sort of corrupt him with society? Because, of course, a child has to adapt to society in any number of ways, from learning how to use the toilet to, like, wearing clothes. This ultra-liberal idea, no, they're just, you're suppressing their spirit, which belongs to another gender. It doesn't really make sense. I mean, as Andrew Doyle always says, it comes down to the idea of a sex soul. You have to believe that their soul is the other gender. That's already a sort of highly questionable quasi-religious view, or pseudo-religious perhaps. So, and then I was going to ask you, I was going to say about the postmodernists, because where does the gender movement come from? Is it, and because people ask this question about wokeness in general, whatever you want to call it, is it postmodern thought? Is it the Frankfurt School? Is it Derrida? Is it certain laws that have been passed? Is it the Equalities Act 2010? But then how come it's across the West? I mean, what's your take on that? It's a big question, but
I mean, you can certainly see its roots in some of these postmodernistic theories, but I think most of the population that are going along with this are not considering it in that deeper manner. I think it's managed basically to infiltrate its way into society through manipulating language, through shaming and guilt tripping people, through putting the fear of God into people, that if they don't comply, that they're going to be outed as some sort of bigot. And so it's created this kind of perfect storm, really, where even if people feel that it's not in their interests or their children's interests, they might still go along with it for fear of being, as I said, kind of outed as some sort of monster. I mean, so, in terms of the other side, proponents of this ideology, I think they've played it pretty smartly. I think they've played it strategically very well up until recently. I think they bit off more than they could chew. They've gone too far, and now we seem to be seeing a bit of a rolling back of all of this, which is good. But I mean, the fact that they've got this ideology. I mean, even look outside during Pride Month. The amount of major corporations who are happy to virtue signal with flags and pronouns and all the rest of it. I mean, it's impressive. And I only noticed this. I joined fairly late to the party on this one. I only noticed this happening a few years ago. But it's been going on in one form or another for decades.
Yeah, and a lot of the companies, maybe we'll come back to that, but that seems to do with ESG scores and things. They're able to get funding if they present certain views, and it seems to come down to their ESG score rather than any sort of sincerity. But on the previous point about the way this has taken hold and whether people really understand the roots of it, I mean, I doubt the teacher at Rye College had read Derrida. She didn't sound like too much of a reader to me, but she was like, if anyone's missed this somehow, there's this video came out, and this teacher was berating two children, saying that they were sort of basically bigots, and that it was terrible that they had their sort of what would be kind of called gender critical views or just common sense views, and she said their parents were bad and they should go to another school because this school we believe in this. And the media have sold it as like, oh, this was a person that identified as a cat, and they've kind of taken it down that red herring, which is there was meant to be a student identified as a cat, and people say no, there wasn't a student. Yes, there was. But the bigger point to me was always how ideologically captured the teacher was in that video, where she was telling the children off quite aggressively because they said you can't be a cow. This is sort of not. There's only two sexes. And it just showed to me that people will just unthinkingly regurgitate this stuff. And it reminded me of the police when that policeman said he had to check someone's thinking because they'd liked a limerick about trans people that was maybe a bit sort of mocking it. And he said he'd done a course and that you can have like the brain of the other gender. Like, oh, you've done a course, have you? So one of the dangers is just people sort of unthinkingly taking this ideology on and not realizing that it's actually highly contentious.
No, completely. And these courses are 10 a penny, and there's all sorts of wonderful quote unquote charities who are going to come and educate your workforce for a hefty sum on this stuff. And employers are happy to do it because it's a bit of a tick box exercise and it signals how virtuous they are. But I mean, yeah, going back to what you said about the teacher there, it's crazy because these vocations should be, ideologically, politically neutral anyway. So they certainly shouldn't be shutting down or trying to shame, young students because they dare to challenge or put forward different ways of thinking. But it's particularly concerning when, again, I come back to this idea that what we're dealing with is material reality. We sex is binary and immutable, and there is nothing to suggest that it isn't. And that is how we've operated in this universe since time immemorial. And it reflects the law of the land as well. And so it's utterly bizarre that students who stand up for that can be shamed in front of their classmates by teachers. I mean, and I don't know whether this particular student was identifying as a cat. I do know there's lots of students out there identifying as different animals and inanimate objects because I've seen them, I've watched their videos online, I've read their blog posts, so this people are getting bogged down as to whether this particular student was a cat or wasn't. It's that, for me, that's not the issue. The issue is the way in which this teacher was, as I said, effectively shutting down students who have genuine concerns about the impact of this ideology within their classroom.
Yeah, exactly. I felt very much the cat was a sort of misnomer. It was less important. People focus on that. Exactly, it was the shutting down of it was the teacher's attitude that was so terrifying. And then when you realise that must be the case in schools everywhere, in many places. And one slight left turn here, a question that's bothered me is why are the vast majority, or it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like the vast majority of these transitions are male to female, or we did a story a few weeks ago on GB News about that, and it was, I can't remember the exact context, but it was like 97% of them, of the requests were going in that direction. Is that accurate?
It used to be. Historically, it was almost exclusively boys and men seeking to transition, but it's flipped now. There's a new phenomenon which has been entitled rapid onset gender dysphoria, and it's kind of pubescent adolescent girls now. And if we look at the statistics over who is presenting to the Tavistock over recent times and other gender clinics, the ratio is inverse, and it's more young teenage girls now that are seeking to transition, which brings up a question of why that is. And myself and others are arguing that it's partly on the basis of contagion. Gender dysphoria is a mental health condition. It is common for mental health conditions to pass between people via contagion, and particularly amongst girls, and particularly amongst young girls. And we've seen that with eating disorders and depressive tendencies. We've even seen it more recently with Tourette's syndrome. Historically, it was almost exclusively boys presenting with Tourette's. Again, now there's been a huge uplift in the number of girls presenting with it. So this is telling us something about what's going on in our society and also in our schools, because I'll hear of multiple girls coming out as trans in a single class.
And one thing I was going to ask is, it's interesting, it's shifted now. So that sort of ruins some of my theories on it. But one thing I always wondered is actually, is it to do with misogyny is one question I always had, because I felt, so you often see the gender critical feminist, whatever term we're using, and they say this is misogyny, and it's quite a useful rhetorical device, if nothing else, because no one likes misogyny, so you say this is misogyny. And I've been struggling with that. I think like one way I put it is that some of the outcomes are misogynist, like a man in a female changing room could be seen as sort of a misogynist outcome, but I'm not convinced the motivation is misogynist, because it seems to come from more like the radical left. And then I eventually read a Substack article, I can't find it now, but it said that actually it was an outcrop of feminism, which is more what I thought. I thought it was more like a sort of continuation of like radical progressivism ending up at the trans movement. Or do you disagree? Do you think it is misogynist at core?
I'm not going to be that simplistic about it, because I think there's a variety of causes, and I think people have come at it from different angles. I mean, we can see that by virtue of the fact that on this topic there's huge amounts of infighting, and I see it because I engage with a lot of women's rights groups, a lot of feminists, etc., and some factions are at loggerheads with each other over this. Equally, I'm not infrequently told to basically sit down and shut up because I'm a bloke, and so I should kind of leave this to women to talk about. So, as I say, there's a lot of infighting, unfortunately. I do believe there are some elements of misogyny here. I do believe that there are some elements of homophobia here. I do believe there are some elements of trying to take advantage for kind of the purposes of sexual perversion and take advantage of loopholes, etc. But there's no one simplistic answer for it. And I think if we try and pin an entire ideology that's taken over society on a single word, I think we'll come unstuck.
So do you think that misogyny is just being used more to sort of discredit them in a kind of fairly clever tactical way, or do perhaps those people saying it believe that's what it is?
Well, look, undoubtedly, and I speak a lot about this. I mean, women as a subset have been hugely impacted by this, whether it's the sanctity of their spaces, whether it's just the language used to describe women and what a woman is, whether it's fairness in sports, etc. So there's definitely something here. I can't say whether the roots of it are misogyny. You'd have to go and speak to some of the individuals spouting this nonsense and find out on what basis they're approaching this from. So I'm not ruling it out, and there's definitely an element of it, but I wouldn't say it's the sole cause.
Yeah, it is interesting how conservatives. I mean, I've ended up defending. If I'm a conservative, I don't know. I've ended up defending women so many times over these issues on the TV and stuff. Whereas you think, whereas I'm certainly not a feminist. And you would think, it's just interesting. The people that have ended up defending women on this are often ostensible conservatives. I mean, you do get some people who are lefties, like Josh on our show, who are big lefties, but they're very big on defending women on the trans issue. But a lot of the times, the left sort of go along with the full suite of sort of woke beliefs. So yeah, I'm just sort of always trying to unpick that. But
I struggle a bit because I don't like identity politics at all. I also support and champion free speech, and I think that people should be able to debate and discuss whatever they want, and I don't believe in shaming people because of their political leanings or whatever. But even within this discussion, the realms of gender ideology, that still kind of occurs. I mean, I don't talk about it very much, but I voted to leave the European Union. Now, that doesn't go down particularly well amongst a lot of the networks that I engage in. I'm not ashamed of it, but it shows. You can be so wholly aligned with groups of people on one issue, and then they discover some other political leaning you've got, and they can switch off, or they can kind of write you off as being some sort of, I don't know, extremist or something. And I think it's a shame, particularly when we should be prioritizing what's important. And like I said, if children's well-being and safety is on the line, whether somebody did or didn't vote to leave the European Union, as far as I'm concerned, is utterly inconsequential.
Yeah, that's absolutely mad to worry about that. And exactly, it is children's safety. And that's why people have to speak up. I mean, if you can't draw a line there at children's safety, then I just have no time for you. If you're prepared to sacrifice that for for virtue signaling or for promoting your ideology, you're prepared to put children at risk who are going to transition, and then they won't be able to go back. I mean, this is a big lie, isn't it? As well, that people can transition back with sort of no problems. Whereas hasn't it just been conclusively disproved at this point with things like puberty blockers that you can't go back?
Well, it's kind of obvious. I mean, they'll make the argument that puberty blockers are reversible, i.e., if you stop taking them, you can commence puberty again. Now, firstly, that's not true because the studies show that it impacts brain and development and bone growth, etc. But actually, if we just think about the kind of social or emotional impact that this would have, a child who is meant to start puberty at 9 or 10 and doesn't start it until 14 or 15, while all their peers in their school have already well on their way through puberty, that isn't normal, and you can never go back again from that. So it has untold social effects on these children. Cross-sex hormones can leave these children permanently infertile. I mean, you can't get more serious than this. And when we go on to things like sex reassignment surgery, which isn't being performed in this country on children, but is being performed on children abroad, Yeah, of course, I mean, that's the most obvious form of irreversible transitioning because you're literally removing healthy parts of somebody's body that they can't get back again.
Horrific. What did you think to that recent march? I wish I had it in front of me. We covered the story last night on Headliners as we record this, and it was this story about this march saying we're here, we're queer, we're coming for your children, and this kicked off on Twitter. And then there was an article about it saying, well, no, you've got to look at the full context. And the full context wasn't better. It seemed to be just like they were joking. I mean, it's not a great joke when you're in public and you're happy to say we're coming for your children. Not a joke I would make. And I've been a professional comedian for 11 years. But like, I mean, was it just a parody of what the right thinks about them, or was it just a weird admission?
I mean, it was very bizarre. I'm wondering whether you should offer stand-up comedy lessons to some of these individuals. But yeah, look, I think it's quite telling. You know, there's no smoke without fire, and everything is said for a reason, subconsciously or consciously. And you know, I think we were told for many years that people just want to live a quiet life. Just let us be, let us exist. But actually, from what I've heard, it's a lot about trying to impose themselves on other people. When I've spoken out about men using women's toilets, for example, I've had messages on Twitter saying, people like me have been using women's toilets for years. You probably don't even know about it. There's nothing you can do about it. I mean, that's kind of threatening and also just a bit creepy. I've even seen, I can't remember this person's name, but supposedly someone who's designed one of the types of chips that we use in computers and in certain laptops was transgender. And someone gleefully wrote to me once saying that every time I open my laptop, there's a piece of a trans person there with me because their chip is in my computer. Just very bizarre.
Yeah, you do wonder about someone's motives. Did you see this case that just came out about the Essex school, where
Yes.
there was several assaults in a gender-neutral toilet, and it came out that there was no written guidance on toilets, there was no official sort of policy, there's no impact assessment done, and so they had these toilets, and apparently if you're supposed to have separate toilets from age 8 up, or there's some sort of rule, but only 28% schools, 28% of schools have them. Again, I wish I had it in front of me, but did you see that case?
I did, and it's disgusting and it's very saddening, and it's exactly what we predicted would happen. And it's not the first school in which this has happened, and it won't be the last school. But again, the responses I see from the other side are quite worrying, really. You think that maybe at a time like this, they'd be able to acknowledge, actually, yeah, this is pretty bad. Maybe we need to rethink some of this. But instead, I've seen online people saying, you know, gender neutral toilets are absolutely fine. I've got one in my home, you know, as if that's some sort of direct comparison. Or people have said, well, there was no risk here because there were individual cubicles within the toilet. But that doesn't really matter because this is still behind closed doors. You know, this isn't out there in the open. There aren't CCTV cameras in there. So it's going to attract possibility of dodgy things happening, irrespective of whether there's separate cubicles within the toilet or not. But I just, it's so horrific to hear about this, and in a school of all places.
I wonder what would make them change their mind or accept they might be wrong. I mean, with ideology, when it's that ingrained, probably nothing. But, you know, the Isla Bryson case did do that in Scotland for a lot of people. And obviously Sturgeon had the financial issues as well. But this was certainly radically unpopular when you had a male rapist in a female prison. And this seemed to be one that like everyone noticed, and it sort of went mainstream. Do you think that might have changed some people's minds? And if not that, what would change people's minds, do you think?
I think it changed the minds of people who aren't immersed in this every day. I think the kind of more middle ground, I think, yeah, it did change the minds. In terms of those who are kind of hardened ideologues, no, I don't think it did, because, again, I saw the commentary on this, and it was basically, how dare you accuse and assume all trans people of being racist, Freudian slip, rapists, you know, which is not what anyone was saying, again. You know, so it's this distortion of language, because, of course, what we're saying is, unfortunately, the vast majority of sexual assaults, etc., are committed by men. These transgender individuals are biologically men, and so therefore women in women's prisons deserve the same protection from them as they do any other man, irrespective of whether or not they've said that they transitioned or have changed the length of their hair or their pronouns. So no, I think it didn't change harden people's views, and I don't know what it's going to take. I actually am convinced that nothing would change how they feel, and I think things get a lot worse. Um, on the sports front, I fear it's only a matter of time until some woman gets very badly injured or even killed uh, playing sport against a man. Equally, if we see women's spaces like refuges and toilets and changing rooms being encroached upon even more, I dread to think what's awaiting us. But I don't think it will change these people's minds, because I think they believe this with an almost kind of religious fervor.
Didn't on the hurting someone seriously? Didn't Fallon Fox already beat up a woman in MMA?
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I mean, well, there we go. That's already an example of somebody coming to harm as part of this. Um, and again, we're seeing a number of sporting bodies starting to do the right thing, but we've got such an inconsistent approach. I mean, sex is either binary and immutable or it isn't. Men can either become women or they can't. And we need a consistent approach, like across all sports and across all of society on this. This kind of pick and mix doesn't really work.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, the ideologues will never change their mind. You just have to change the mind of enough of the public. And Andrew Doyle talked about it. I interviewed him on this. We talked about his book, New Puritans, where at the end he compared it to the Salem witch trials, and he said that they still tried. They tried the same trick of saying, "Oh, that's a witch," but it just stopped working suddenly. There was this incident where everyone just ignored them. I think that's probably what it'll take, enough of the public to just start ignoring this rubbish and basically saying no. And I think a little bit of that did happen in Scotland with the demise of Sturgeon. That was my take on it. So maybe that's the way, just enough of the public see it for what it is. And it is happening, like you say, a little bit in sports. We see Sharon Davis has a book out about it. We just saw Judy Murray tweet about it, who's obviously Andy Murray's mum, pretty sort of public, well-known mainstream sporting figure. Martina Navratilova talks about it. And we also saw, not a sports figure, but we also saw Davina McCall talking about a podcast called The Witch Trials of J.K. Rowling, I believe. And she said, this is a well-balanced podcast. I recommend it. Small things, but I do notice these small shifts and people just putting their head above the parapet a little bit, very mainstream figures. What do you think?
I agree. I don't think it's going to be a kind of overnight thing, because people are having to find their courage, unfortunately, on this one. But again, I spoke to somebody yesterday who is in Ireland, and they were recounting that last year they walked out. They're in a kind of small village, and last year they went down the high street there, and all of the shops had, during Pride Month, flags and pronouns plastered in the walls. And this year there was barely anything at all, and she noticed that. And so maybe that's kind of the first step for people, that maybe they don't put up the pride flag, maybe they don't put the pronouns in the biography, and maybe eventually over time they get the confidence to actually stand up in front of friends or family or even at work and say, actually, I don't think men can become women. That's the hope.
I mean, if some children can do it, then adults should have the courage. I mean, and then there's the boycotts, isn't there? There's this Bud Light boycott, which was massively successful in America, and the Target boycott. And then there's a little bit of that over here with the Wix boycott. Looks like we might try and do the same thing. Then Starbucks apparently took down some of their Pride stuff. This was the claim anyway. A union was striking in response to it, saying, no, we want the right to put up our Pride nonsense. So do you see boycotts as a way of doing this?
Seems to be pretty effective. I mean, Wix took a bit of a battering over here, as did their share price. I mean, I kind of blew the lid on what was going on in Wix and what one of the senior directors was saying, but it was particularly interesting with the Wix, because he basically was saying, people who disagree with me on this issue, but I think basically people who don't believe that, transgender people exist and that men can become women and vice versa, that they're not welcome in our stores anymore. So when people were kind of saying boycotting Wix, I don't think it wasn't really a boycott in the kind of traditional sense of the word. It was, if this guy is saying to us as prospective customers, we're not welcome in his stores, then we'll prove him right, and we won't bother shopping there at all and see how he likes it. But I think we're going to need that, because a lot of corporations are fully bought into this. And I sat in on some webinar that was being organised by various trans activist groups. And I remember one of them saying that they feel quietly confident about the way things are going to go in society, irrespective of whether politics and the media and even medical institutions turn against them, because they feel that they've got the corporate space wholly caught, basically, and they know how much sway and influence these private corporations can have. So that was, when I heard that was quite chilling. And I've spent a lot more of my time since then focusing on these private companies who are just throwing this stuff out there in pursuit of profit, basically.
Yeah. And isn't the problem this ESG stuff? I mean, Elon Musk said ESG, and we'll get on to Musk. I didn't mean to like tease that at the start. I'm getting around to that soon. But he said ESG is the devil. And ESG seems to be, we did an article about this on GB, where basically Tesla had a much lower ESG score than Chevron, the oil company, and Philip Morris, which promotes smoking. Highly unethical company. Well, Chevron, whatever you think to them, but I think we can argue that a smoking company is pretty unethical in many ways. They had a much better ESG score because they have a sort of pattern of diversity. They sort of tick the boxes of Stonewall-esque nonsense, whatever it is. It may not be actually Stonewall in the US, but it's it's another version of that corporate something. There's some name for it, isn't there? That James Lindsay talked about. I can't remember now, but it's an ESG type thing, and it basically says it doesn't matter what your company does, as long as you tick these boxes we want, you'll get this score, and then you seem to get funding. I don't quite understand the funding model, because like the Wix guy, you seem to be able to alienate your customers, knowing that you're going to get the funding from these bodies. Or in the case of Twitter, they tried to shut down Musk's advertising by these big agencies recommend that Coca-Cola and McDonald's and 5 other massive companies don't go on Twitter, and that's how they hammer you. Somehow these companies have so much power, and they're almost more important than customers.
Yeah, it's pretty bizarre. And yes, there's the kind of more overt funding that you've mentioned and sponsorship deals, etc. And then there's the kind of softer benefits that come with it. I mean, Stonewall still published their list of kind of approved employers and this top 100 list. And there's a lot of employers out there who consider it kind of gold dust to be on that list because of the exposure and the extra publicity it gets them. And they're basically having prospective employees and customers being funneled through to them through these other to these groups, these charities, these other organizations. It's very odd. And they're not even thinking holistically again about all people's rights. I mean, you would think that a company would be marked on how it treats all of its staff. But, I when I saw recently that Virgin Atlantic was celebrating the fact that they now have introduced gender neutral toilets in all of their offices, for example. What about the impact that's having on women again, and how that's making them feel and their rights as a kind of protected class? That seems to go out the window because all they want is a trans pride flag and then job done, basically.
Yeah, Stonewall's a particularly bad example, or a good example, because they have, egregious example. They have this diversity champions program, and you'd think that, I always say this, that Stephen Nolan's investigative work should have ended that. He had this documentary on BBC where he exposed Stonewall. It's basically, you want to get in our diversity table where you need to ask advice and how to get into it and pay for that. Who do you pay? Oh, Stonewall. So it's this absurd pyramid scheme, and that should have ended that completely, but it still goes on, like you say, and companies are still doing this nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I'm sad that it still exists, although, a lot of companies and other organizations have withdrawn from it. But there's still, I looked the other day at who was in the most recent kind of top 100 list. You've still got police forces, you've still got banks, you've still got universities. There's large swathes of society that are still utterly wrapped up in all of this. But Stonewall generally, I think, are a lot more discredited than they used to be. I still remember last year when they put out a tweet saying that their 2-year-olds can be trans, and they got absolutely massacred in social media and in commentary on this because, of course, that's utterly untrue. And since then, I found that people just don't seem to trust them that much. Similarly with mermaids, we're still waiting to hear the outcome of this charity commission investigation into them. But they still, unfortunately, have a lot of clout and a lot of support and a lot of funding.
Yeah, I know. It's shocking. And all right, let's get on to this Musk thing before I do the whole podcast and don't manage to get onto it, because this is sort of topical as we record. So you tweeted here yesterday after posting a tweet saying that I reject the word cis and don't wish to be called it. I receive a slew of messages from trans activists calling me sissy and telling me that I'm cis whether I like it or not, whether or not I like it. Just imagine if the roles were reversed. Then Elon Musk replied, repeated targeted harassment against any account will cause the harassing accounts to receive, at minimum, temporary suspensions. The words cis or cisgender are considered slurs on this platform. And this was sort of quite interesting and controversial. This idea, now obviously you were getting all this abuse, but this idea, which is never pleasant, but this idea that cis was a slur, do you think that's the right direction? Now some people say, how can that be the case on sort of free speech grounds? But then if it's harassment, maybe there's an argument. And should you be able to harass someone with, like, should you be able to say a racial slur to people, or even a sort of so-called mild racial slur like gammon? You know, is harassment a thing? Do we have to police it in this way? Do you think Musk was right, basically?
I do think Musk was right. I don't think he was attempting to engage in censorship, and I kind of followed up after he wrote that with basically saying that all he's done is kind of restored parity, and that's all I was asking for. Because the reason I started this in the first place was to try and see, okay, I'm constantly being told that if I misgender somebody, even accidentally, that could be the equivalent of a literal violence against them. So, well, if they're imposing labels on me that I don't want, and I tell them about it, how will they respond? Will they respect my wishes? And of course they didn't, because I had people telling me whether or not you like it, you're cis, and telling me to go kill myself. So I believe that Musk was simply just restoring parity there. As I said earlier, I champion free speech. I believe that people should be able to say kind of what they want to say, which is why I don't kind of engage in my own witch hunts of trying to kind of shut people down. However, that doesn't mean that people can't be called out for their bullshit, to be honest with you. And so do I want to move towards a world where people are not having the word cisgender imposed upon them against their wishes? Yes. Do I want to shut down people who use the word cisgender and cancel them from social media, have them fired from their jobs? No. You know, I don't think those things are kind of mutually exclusive.
So yeah, it's an annoying hypocritical slur, to say the least, but should they be suspended then for tweet shouting cis at you repeatedly?
Well, Twitter, like every other social media platform, has got policies around harassment. So if what somebody is saying to you reaches the level of harassment, and it just so happens that it's because they're calling you cis or whatever, then why not? If it meets that threshold for harassing somebody. But do I believe that somebody should be suspended because they utter the word cis? No.
Because Musk modified the rule on misgendering, didn't he? Because you used to be able to get suspended just for sort of so-called misgendering, and I think he took that out. But now perhaps the difference is harassment. Then it's not the word. Because to me, the only with free speech, the line is incitement, and that line is drawn in, for example, the First Amendment in America. It's pretty clear, fighting words. If you say, "Oh, go and punch that guy now," that's harassment. But it's, as Andrew Dawes said on this podcast, it's not the speech there that's the problem. It's you're using the speech as a weapon. It just happens to be speech you're using, but it's really the incitement part, immediate incitement to violence. But short of that, I say you probably should be able to say anything. But you know, I was debating with Toby whether it's worse to sort of repeatedly tweet a racial slur at someone versus the word cis. Or I said, well, what about the word gammon, just as an interesting example. But he was saying the problem is with like really severe racial slurs like the N-word is that they shut down someone's speech because they kind of, I don't know, I can't remember the exact point. Somehow that shuts down the person from being able to use their free speech because they're so harassed by this sort of historically egregious word. But I said, well, where do you draw the line? That seemed very subjective to me. Is gammon, that's also a racial slur. If cis is incredibly offensive because we're not cis, as you said. I don't know, that's a tricky one to me. But you're just simply saying, I just want equal treatment on the extant harassment rules on that platform, basically.
Yeah, well, more than anything, I just wanted to point out the hypocrisy of this. I mean, my original tweet where I said I don't want to be called cis, and I tried to mirror the language that the other side used. So I said, when you call me cis, it makes me feel unsafe. Now, no, it doesn't make me feel unsafe. But I was mirroring their language to see if they'd be empathetic to it, if I could have a connection with them on that level. But as I said, the hypocrisy is there for all to see. So that's what I was doing more than anything else. But yes, I do want parity of treatment, certainly. I would argue that actually calling somebody cis is even worse than misgendering. Because again, we have to come back to this idea of what is real and what isn't. Calling a biological male, well, that is objective truth. Imposing this label of cis on people is forcing them into an ideological framework that they don't believe in. I don't see how it's much different to trying to impose some religious framework on people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, it goes back to the old Norm Macdonald joke. Cis is a way of marginalizing a normal person. Have you ever seen that? That was his brilliant line about it. And you remind me there of what Michael Knowles said on his show. So he said that there is a key difference. You're saying parity, but he actually said more than parity he wanted, because he said there's a key difference, which is that this is the truth. This is simply the truth about biological sex, whereas the misgendering claim is based on a fiction. So he drew a distinction there and said they're not equal. Cis shouldn't be allowed because it's spreading a provable falsehood, something like that. I mean, Steve on our show, Steve Allen on our show, Headliners, argues sort of for cis because he says it's just a scientific subcategory or subset that is used in science or something. But so he used it on Julia Hartley Brewer's show, and he was kicked off. She said, "I'll kick you off if you keep using that language," which is hilarious. But he actually has been back since. But because he thinks he's just using it in a sort of very rational, sort of just simply scientific way. But isn't it that kind of pseudoscience, really?
Well, yeah, but even the roots of this term, I'd say I posted about this again yesterday, and I'd say every other message I get is telling me it's just this is from Latin, therefore it's okay. I actually had someone who's a linguistic expert who studied Latin and classical languages, and he sent me a long message explaining to me why cis actually is wholly illiterate. It doesn't even make sense to use it in the way that they're using it. It actually means nothing in the context that they're using it, which I may put out a tweet of that at some point, although he went into a lot of detail on it because he's a bit of an expert on these things. But what they're saying doesn't even make sense. I don't care what language it comes from. I don't care if it's used in other contexts, like a scientific context. I care about the context it's been using in here, which is it is to shut people down. It's to force people into a box, into a kind of subcategory. And you can see this because I will come across scenarios in which, well, for example, I came across at some community swimming pool, they're running like trans-only sessions and things like that. Well, I can see a scenario in which they're kind of categorizing groups of people into cisgender and therefore trying to, in their own way, also exclude groups of people on that basis as well. And I see it being used to shut down debate. I've been told time and time again in the past that, I've got no right to comment on these issues because I don't have the lived experience of being trans because I'm merely cisgender. How is that helpful?
Yeah, even if you look at the quick definition of it, it's cisgender, denoting or relating to a person whose gender identity corresponds with the sex registered for them at birth, not transgender. It's a completely absurd thing to define something as not transgender when transgender people are such a tiny percentage of society. So to define the vast majority of people as not transgender, also based on this spurious claim about gender that's wholly ideological, yeah, it's completely absurd. So if that takes hold, yeah, and like you say, and of course it is incredibly offensive, and of course we don't follow their ideology. And people are now responding to it by saying things like, sorry, I don't follow your religion. But as you say, it's imposed upon you. The word cis puts you within their framework. And of course, that's exactly what it's designed to do.
Of course. But how is it different to forcing and compelling speech in other ways or putting labels upon people? I mean, imagine if employers were putting pressure on their employees to put their religious beliefs in their signature or their disability status in their signature. I mean, how is it any different to that whatsoever? If an employer turned around to you and said, I want you to put your religion in your signature, I mean, you would think that this was absolutely atrocious, but for some reason, them encouraging you in a smiley way, put your pronouns in your signatures if that makes it all right. I mean, it's the same thing.
I know. And you just reminded me of why I couldn't ever work in the normal workplace. I basically have to be in alternative media where we sort of tackle these issues. Because any other job, if I was doing it, I mean, even the comedy world, I had to leave. But any normal job, put your pronouns in your signature. No. Okay, am I fired? I mean, which is what happened to you. You proved it. I mean, you can't be in a normal job when this has become the norm. I couldn't, if I had to state my unconscious bias or say my pronouns at the start of a meeting, it's never going to happen.
Well, I actually not so long ago had a job interview, and the very first words to come out of the interviewer's mouth were, "Please let me know if you'd like me to address you by different pronouns." And that sets the scene and the tone for what's about to come. And they think that they're being inclusive in doing that, but what they don't realize is that by saying that, they're actually alienating the vast majority of people who will be sat in front of them.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's much like the teacher at Rye College again. They've been captured. There's been a revolution. There's been a sort of stealth revolution. There's been a takeover by this ideology. They just think it's the norm. They think it's politeness. They think it's HR. It's like, no, this is a highly contentious, highly destructive, toxic ideology that we're trying to fight here. I mean, what do you do in a situation like that? Do you just walk out at the very question?
I just smiled and said nothing. To be honest, I wasn't even prepared to offer a response to it.
Just smile. You realize you're dealing with a moron. Just smile politely. A few other quick questions because we're coming up to an hour, but I just want to quickly ask a few things. Are we doing better on this, Britain, than other countries? You mentioned we're ahead on some legislation. America seems to be doing particularly badly. We seem to be doing a bit better to the point where we're called Turf Island, which I think we can say with pride. I call my other podcast this week Turf Island. We started speculating about a ride called Turf Island, like a Disney ride, where you start at Turf Island, then you get plunged into a changing room, and then you come out back at Turf Island. Yeah, it was a long bit. Listen to Weekly Skeptic for that comedy gold. But Turf Island, are we actually doing better in Britain, James, fighting this stuff than other countries?
Yeah, we are, which is kind of worrying because we're still not doing that great. But yeah, we actually are. We're doing better than, America's an absolute mess, as is Canada, as is Ireland. And again, even within a nation like England's doing a lot better than Scotland and Wales are. But yes, we're doing quite well. I mean, the recent statement put out by NHS England saying that their proposal is to prevent puberty blockers being used outside of clinical trials. I mean, okay, I don't believe puberty blockers should ever be used, even in trials, but that's a big step forward. Closing down the Tavistock is a big step forward. As pathetic as it is to say it, the fact that Rishi Sunak has come out previously and said that that women don't have penises, that's for us, that's a big step forward. So in the grand scheme of things, we're doing all right, actually. But there's a hell of a lot more left to do, and I'm concerned about the next election. I'm considering what I need to do in terms of advocating and campaigning around that. I did a little quick search the other day through all of the major political parties in the UK and what leaders have said on this recently, and every major political party leader, bar Rishi Sunak, has said in one form or another that women can have a penis. So that tells us about the state of play of politics in this country.
I know. I occasionally step back out of my kind of day job of all this culture war stuff and just step back and go, hang on, we're just debating whether women have penises and can be men. And it's like, so do you ever just step back and just realize how mad this is? I mean, because we live it every day. We're so in this culture war, but probably when we grew up, or I'm a little bit older than you, but this is just beyond thinkable. So it's just, I sometimes just step back and go, how are we here? Rishi Sunak saying, a woman doesn't have a penis. Well, yes, get in. It's not much of a win, is it?
Yeah, it's crazy. And I feel so old before my time. I feel like those old folks who say, oh, in my day. And, I'm young, I'm 31, but I feel like saying that to people these days. In my day, we knew what men and women were, and the problem is the new generation have been brought up with this gender ideology nonsense. They're being taught in the schools, and we see that carrying through to universities and the shutdown of speech there. So I'm worried longer term as well. I even feel like even if we make some advancements in the short term, I'm worried that it will all go backwards again once the students and the young people of today who have unfortunately been indoctrinated into this are the leaders of tomorrow.
Yeah, unless they grow up a bit and grow out of it. But yeah, and you mentioned Ireland. Haven't they just introduced a bill that could potentially lead you to going to prison for misgendering someone, potentially?
Yeah, they're trying to introduce this hate crime legislation, which yes could potentially criminalise misgendering. That's I'm from Ireland. I grew up there till I was 18. It makes me very sad to see what's happening in that country. Um, I think that they've just swung so far the other direction. They introduced self ID. There's been recent recommendations about extending those provisions to children, so the children can self ID as whatever sex they want. They're looking to ban conversion therapy, and we spoke about the risks of that earlier. So I'm very worried, and I hope that as and when things get sorted in the UK a bit more, I can go over and do some more campaigning in Ireland.
And do you think, sometimes I ask on this podcast, is Britain finished? But maybe you can answer for Ireland as well if you identify more as Irish. I don't know which way you identify, James. But do you have any hope for the future of this country or Ireland?
I don't know about Ireland, truthfully. It's been going the wrong direction for quite some time. This country will be dependent on the next couple of elections. I'm very fearful of the Labour Party getting in. I think we would take some major steps backwards if that happens. So we're going to need to pile the pressure on. And, the Conservatives haven't been great on this either, but they're the best of a bad bunch, I think.
Yeah, I agree that the Labour will be worse. Everyone thinks, you can't get worse than these Tories, you can't get more incompetent. So it's like you can get a lot worse on the social woke issues, I'm telling you. It can get a lot worse, and will with Labour. I'm 100% with you on that one. Sadly, that looks like it's where it's going. But what about? Here's a quick digression. Are you an atheist?
I don't really actually have a label for this one. I was brought up and was practicing Judaism for many years. These days, I don't really identify as anything.
Okay. Do you think the lack of religion, specifically in this country, the decline of Christianity, has left a vacuum to be filled by this woke stuff?
Yes, yeah, okay. I do, because people need, as human beings, we strive and have this innate need for certainty and belief, something bigger than us that we can get behind. And so, yeah, I do believe that the erosion of religious beliefs has kind of opened a gap in the market for this. I don't really know what we can do about it, but I actually also think it's a sign of our privilege, and I don't like using that word at all, but I'm going to use it on this occasion, which is that in the Western world and in Britain in particular, we're so privileged that we have the time in the world to engage in this navel gazing and this self-obsessiveness. People living in war-torn countries facing dictators and poverty are not sat at home thinking about their pronouns. And I would say it's actually symptomatic of how privileged we are that we've got this time to become so self-obsessed, where our identity is the most important thing. And we lose sight of wider society and the wider community. It's all about me, me, me.
Yeah, good point. And I'm curious as well, you're pro-assisted dying, I believe. Why is that?
Well, a few reasons. Firstly, it goes back to freedoms again, because as I said earlier, I generally believe that people should be free to what they want to do in life. And so, if somebody doesn't want to live anymore, I don't believe that we should force them into staying alive. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to find ways to help people to live the best possible life and to stay alive if they want to. But I think of this particularly in the context of people who are suffering from the most horrific, even terminal illnesses. I've been a member of the charity Dignity in Dying for a number of years. And I've engaged with some of these people who have got, for example, locked-in syndrome. And I mean, they're living the most horrific existence. And I think we're basically artificially keeping them alive against their wishes. And I don't think that's right. And I find an interesting dynamic between that and abortion as well, even, actually. Because we say, well, a fetus doesn't have a voice, but will allow the mother to make the decision. But when it comes to an adult who is saying, I don't want to live anymore, we're basically saying, tough luck, you've got to stay alive. That kind of seems to be nonsensical, that position. It would almost, I feel like you've kind of almost got to have both or neither. I don't know if you agree with me on that, but...
Well, I'm pro-life anyway, so I'm against assisted dying, and I'm pro-life, so I think I'm pretty consistent. So I don't think I fall into the same hypocrisy you're alluding to. But the concern for me, there's the ethical question and the moral question we almost don't have time to get into because it's such a big question I've just thrown out. But there's a crossover with some of the transgender concerns and transitioning of children that you talk about, which is, you've said there may be financial incentives to do that. And there's other pressures and ideological pressures and so on. Similarly, if we sort of systematize death in that way, it's very easy to imagine being given a leaflet, you sure you don't just want to die, and it being incentivized by the state or by corporations to actually just offer, much in the same way that if you go into an abortion clinic, people can very easily, you have a child, you're not in an abortion clinic, but you can quite often, it can be suggested, do you want to get an abortion first rather than do you want to adopt, or all these kind of other things. Or I've heard cases where it's sort of it seems like it's pressed on people to an extent. Aren't you concerned that would just lead to a sort of situation where, the option of just dying is sort of pressed on people far too aggressively?
I mean, it's a possibility, and slippery slopes are things that we should be aware of. But that's why I would only want the most rigorous kind of thresholds in place. We've seen this in other countries as well. I would only be wanting this in cases where somebody is kind of like terminally ill and has got a certain type of condition. Because we have to remember, people are free to kill themselves anyway. We decriminalized suicide many years ago, and so. The cohort I'm concerned about are the individuals, for example, those who are struggling with locked-in syndrome, who want to kill themselves but physically can't. So but again, that seems to be unfair. Why should somebody who's able-bodied be allowed to kill themselves, but someone who isn't able-bodied be forced to stay alive?
Well, a Christian would say that they're not, but and legally you're saying they are. So legally you do have a point there. Okay, I just thought I'd go into that quickly again because I just heard you say it on a podcast and it sort of surprised me. I thought I'd just throw it out there. But I need to do more research on it so I can defeat your arguments. But I mean, it probably applies to lots of things. But mainly I agree with you, to be honest, so it doesn't come up. But one last question then. I always like to ask how we win this culture war. And I suppose for you, there's a specific, how do we win the gender madness? And then how do we win the larger culture war?
On the gender, we need more people to gain the confidence to speak out, because as you alluded to this earlier, but there'll come a point, like with the witch trials, but there'll come a point if a large enough proportion of society are willing to actually say, no, I'm not going to stand for this, then they can't impose it anymore. And the corporations will follow suit because they're following the profit, at the end of the day. So I think people just need to find the confidence. And I acknowledge the risks that it has for people, and again, I'm an example of somebody who's kind of suffered as a result of speaking out. But I always say that I've got no regrets about speaking out. And if I had my time again, I'd do the exact same thing again. And I hope that can instill just a little bit of confidence in people that even if shit hits the fan, that it will still be all right. And that there's a lot of people out there, myself included, who want to support them in that. In terms of the culture wars more generally, I don't know. I wish I had an answer, but all I know is I find it very, very depressing, and I don't know. It feels like we're going to need some sort of bigger reset in society. As I said, because I believe a lot of this is symptomatic of how privileged we are, I'm not really sure how we can kind of get away from it, save for an event that comes along that makes everyone realize what's actually important in life. Save for some sort of catastrophe. I kind of hoped COVID would at least do that in a way, that people would stop and think, okay, what is really important? But it hasn't. So on that basis, I'm not sure anything will ever solve this.
Right. Yeah, I thought the same. And at the start of COVID, it did end it for about 10 seconds. People briefly sort of came together. And then it actually made the culture war worse. And it became a culture war issue. Masks were a culture war issue. Lockdowns and vaccines and so on. So yeah, you're right. I was just quickly trying to remember the bridge. I can't remember the name of the bridge, but yeah, it's this at the end of Andrew Doyle's book. He talks about this bridge where they tried to say that's a witch, and everyone just ignored them, and that was the end of it. I'd love to have that moment, but oh well. I was trying to get a bit of optimism of how we could win it, but it doesn't look like it's coming. And what are you going to do on a personal level? You've been cancelled kind of twice in a way by your university and your job. I mean, what's your future?
Well, thankfully, I've still got a job because I can keep a roof above my head. I mean, I'd still like to practice psychotherapy, but I'm waiting until the outcome of my litigation, which could take another few years. In the meantime, my concern is purely continuing to try and speak out about these issues, to be honest, and particularly in relation to children. So I'm just going to kind of keep plugging away on that, basically, until we get where we need to get to. I'm trying to think a bit more short term. Because you never know what's going to happen, and I could easily be cancelled again. I could have a trio of cancellations. Who knows? So. Yeah,
well, then you can come back on the podcast. This is who we love, the cancelled people. This is practically all this podcast is. But thanks, James. I mean, you're doing great work. Anyone that stands up for children, it's about the most noble thing you can do. So we applaud you for that. And where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter, occasionally engaging with Elon Musk. Alternatively, I've got a Substack where I put out regular articles, and I've got a crowd justice page on my litigation where people can donate and support my legal case if they like to as well.
So your Twitter is at James Esses, James ESSES, of course. And if you listen to the episode, you probably see it in the title. And the Substack is what?
It's actually called Transparency, but it's I've got the domain. If you just go onto jamesesses.com, but if you type my name into Google, that will be one of the top hits, as will the crowd justice page, and you can sign up there, and I give updates on my litigation as it progresses.
Okay, yeah, and you've got the link here on your Twitter at James Esses.
Yeah.
So go to James's Twitter and do that, and absolutely donate if you feel so inclined, because you certainly deserve it. And as you said, it's all going to go to your legal costs. It's not going on your new Bugatti. So thanks so much for doing the show, James.
Pleasure. Nice chatting.